We're in Daniel chapter 2 this evening. I appreciate your joining us for our midweek Bible study. And I want to begin by thanking Colton for leading our singing, Cohen for leading our prayer, and Heg number 2, Todd, for his excellent Devo tonight. The Heggs have a way of saying things that just really comes across well. And I know how hard it is for them, in particular, Todd. It's out of his comfort zone. But he does a superb job, as does Daryl, and he's just going to have to get more comfortable because I don't see him going off the schedule anytime soon. So let him know how much you appreciate his efforts. Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The problem Nebuchadnezzar had was simple. He knew that he had had a dream. In fact, it seems from the text that it was a recurring dream, but he could not remember the substance of the dream. He was impressed with its importance, but he just could not, for the life of him, remember what it was that kept coming to the surface at night. It got so bad that he lost sleep over it, so he summoned his advisors, the astrologers, the soothsayers, the magicians, the Chaldeans, and made 2 demands. Tell me what I dreamed, and tell me what it means. We were in the midst of his expressing those desires when class drew to a close last Wednesday night. I read the first section through verse 16. We pick up our study actually tonight, as near as I can tell, with verse 7, but I think it's important to get the background. We read these verses again together. So I never tire hearing the Word of God, and especially stories like the ones that are found in the first 6 chapters of Daniel. So I would ask you again to simply open your Bible and follow along as we read the text to set the stage for the things that we'll be noting this evening. The king, this is Nebuchadnezzar, answered and said to the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans is a term that is used in 2 ways in the book of Daniel. It describes a group of men who served as advisors to the king, and it's also used in a much more general sense to mean simply Babylonians, people of Babylon. The Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, "O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation." So the king says to the Chaldeans, "The word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and its interpretation." They answered a second time and said, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation." The king answered and said, "I know with certainty that you're trying to gain time, because you see that the word from me is firm. If you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation." The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There's not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asked is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh." Because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree of the king so urgent?" Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. And Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. So I know we read that section last week, but I suspect that it's always helpful to refresh our memories. The passage that's on the slide at the moment was the passage we were looking at when we concluded our study last week. And it's simply the first time that the king says, quite frankly, to the men that he trusted as his advisors, "You have two responsibilities. Tell me what I dreamed, and tell me what it means, its interpretation." Now, as we continue, their response was a second time. They answered, "The king tells his servants the dream, and then we show its interpretation. We know what you demand, but it doesn't work that way. You tell us what you dreamed, and then our responsibility is to tell you what it means." Now, you can see, I think, very easily that their desire to have the king tell the dream before they interpret it comes from a very simple truth. They don't have a clue what the king dreamed, and they have no way of knowing unless he tells them. They're respected in Babylon as sage advisors. They are supposed to have a connection to the gods. They are supposed to be able to see the future and answer the unanswerable because of that special relationship which they have with their deities. But their deities don't exist, and therefore those connections are non-existent, and it simply is not within the realm of possibility for them to answer the king's request. So the king answered and said, "I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time." Now, I don't know exactly what he means when he says you're trying to gain time. And I've done extensive reading, and I can't find anybody else who actually knows with certainty. I suspect that what he's saying is you're putting me off until you think, "I'll forget it." You know, over time, that's the way most of us work, is it not? If we don't see things frequently, if we don't hear them often, if we don't constantly refresh our memories, those things seem to go by the wayside, or at least that's my experience. And as I read the text, it seems to me, and you're certainly entitled to see some other meaning in this, but as I read this, I think he's saying to them in reference to trying to gain time, you just are putting me off so that perhaps I'll forget it and you won't have to deal with it. But it's not going to work that way. Because you see that the word from me is firm. This is why you keep wanting to gain time or put it off. I mean what I say. And what I say is this: you either do what I tell you to do, or you will be torn limb from limb, and then your houses will be destroyed. And I suspect more than their structures, often in these kinds of situations, not only do those who fail the king suffer the fate of death, but their families also face a similar fate. And it's not just true in relationship to Babylon. There's a story in Joshua that comes to mind immediately about Achan. Achan, as you recall, took from Jericho a wedge of gold, 200 shekels of silver, and a fancy Babylonian garment, and he buried them in the floor of his tent. And by the way, that was old Babylon. We are now dealing with Neo-Babylon or New Babylon here in the book of Daniel. Well, as a result of Achan's sin, when Israel encountered the little town of Ai, they actually were defeated and they ran like cowards. And Joshua knew as a result there was sin in the camp, And ultimately, Achan was confronted and confessed his sin. Well, you would expect him to perish. But everything he had and every member of his family died as well. They were burned with fire, and a heap of stones cast over them. I suspect that that's a real incentive for people of conscience to want to do what's right. If you suffer as a result of your failure, that's one thing. But if you fail and everybody that is near and dear to you suffers the same punishment, well, that's an incentive to do your best. These men are between the proverbial rock and the hard place. They don't want to fail, but they're destined to fail because they have been asked to do, on the part of men, the impossible. But he says, if you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words. And I believe he's saying here, I'm drawing the conclusion now from your inability to do what I've asked, that you've just been leading me along all this time. You've been lying to me and stating as fact what you do not know to be fact because you lack the ability to know. Lying and corrupt words before me. He says, till the times change. Therefore, tell me the dream. And again, I think until the times change, he's implying here that they're running out of time and that he's tired of their delays. It is time to put up or shut up. And if you can't put up, I'll shut you up because I'll destroy you and everyone that matters to you. And I'll know that you cannot do what you claim to do. So tell me the dream and tell me its interpretation. Again, what is required is not difficult to understand, but for those who have been summoned to the king's service, what he has asked of them is truly impossible. So the Chaldeans answered the king and said, there's not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. You've asked the impossible. No one who is alive today can do what you have asked. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. So their response is, first, you've asked what no human being can do. And secondly, you've asked what no other king would ever dare to ask. You see, kings, wise as they are, will not ask of their subjects and of their advisors the impossible. The thing the king asks is difficult. That's the third reason they give for their failure. You've asked a hard thing. Now, let's be honest. People do hard things all the time. This is beyond hard. It's actually for them impossible. And then they say, no one can show it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. So they actually give 4 reasons, if you look at verses 10 and 11, for their failure. It's not that they don't want to do what the king has asked them to do. It's just not possible. So, because of this, the king was angry, very furious, and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. Now, this is how kings, who are the final word, the last authority, whose edicts are unquestionable, responds. Well, in that case, you will just all die. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed. And they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Obviously, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not present when the soothsayers, astrologers, magicians, and Chaldeans appeared before Nebuchadnezzar and were asked to reveal the dream and its interpretation. But they're still part of this group, and if all of them must die, Daniel and his friends must die as well. Now, I think it's fair to ask, Where were they? Why weren't they present when the king made this demand immediately? I would suggest to you two possibilities. One, the Babylonian magicians, soothsayers, Chaldeans did not want Hebrew boys involved. They were in line for rich rewards and big promotions, and they didn't want those things going to others, especially not foreigners. And it may also be that Daniel and his friends chose not to go before the king because they didn't want to appear to be interested just in what the king had to offer. They've already demonstrated in chapter 1 that they weren't going to eat from the king's table because they didn't want to be defiled. It may simply be now that they don't want to set some kind of example that might cause the king to think that they are improperly motivated. We expect the men in Babylon who advised the king to be so motivated. That's just how people operate in that world and in this world. But it really isn't the way God's people operate. There are matters that matter more than money and promotions, and it may be that that's the case, but their lives are still on the line. The king has dispatched the chief executioner to carry out his orders, and I will tell you that there is some question as to how this was to be done. Was he simply going to arrest and execute as he came upon them, or was he going to bring all of them together and then have a public execution en masse of all of those who failed the king? I don't know the answer to that question. I can't give you a dogmatic response. My guess is, given the fact that it doesn't appear yet that anyone has perished, and Daniel and his three friends are going to be given time to address the king's questions, that it is probably the responsibility of the chief executioner or the captain to gather up, to arrest, and to bring together all of those who are subject to the king's decree of death. And Daniel and his companions would be among that number. But of course, Daniel's a young man, as are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I don't know how soon after the events of chapter 1 that this occurs, but it seems to me, as you read the text, doesn't it, that it's fairly quickly after they finish their education and have been examined by the king that this particular incident occurs. And so they're late teens, early 20s. We would say they're just beginning to live. It's not time to die. You know, death should come when you're old. And I realize the old must die and the young may, but Daniel and his friends, they're just young men, and they're not ready to be executed. So Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard. And again, the original and its Aramaic says that this was the chief executioner. This captain Arioch was the chief executioner for the Babylonians. And I mentioned to you last week that mid-verse 4, we transition from Hebrew to Aramaic, and that continues through the 7th chapter because we're dealing with Babylonian matters, and their language was Aramaic. I had real trouble last week thinking of the word transition. In fact, I couldn't think of it till I sat down. And Klein back there saying to me the next day, I knew all the time what word you wanted. Next time, just shout it out, Mr. Klein. So I will not have to think of a substitute for a simple word that just escaped me. But they transitioned to Aramaic in verse 4, and the word here is best translated chief executioner from what I've been able to learn. He is the captain of the king's guard, the chief executioner, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. And again, the general consensus is he was going to round them up, and then there would be a public execution. Daniel, that is he, declared to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree of the king so urgent? Why does everybody have to die right now, in other words? Why can't we have some time? He may not have yet been informed that the Babylonians had requested additional time, and Nebuchadnezzar had denied their request. As a result of Daniel's question, Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. He explained everything that has taken place up to this point. And Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. Daniel is saying, what all of those folks that you have had so much trust in for so long cannot do, I'm prepared to do. And of course, as you read the continual narrative, Daniel doesn't take credit for it. He will do what the king has requested, but he makes a point of saying, it is not me. It is my God. And the men of Babylon have already acknowledged that what the king has asked, only the gods can answer. And Daniel is prepared to say, there's only one God, and he's the God who knows the matter. He's the one who can give the answer. Then Daniel went to his house, made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions. We know them better as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And again, those are Hebrew names, but we generally remember their Aramaic or Babylonian name. Daniel's Babylonian name is Belteshazzar. We never think of that in relationship to him. We always refer to him as Daniel, and I don't really know why that's the case. It just is. But he told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning the mystery. The word in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, is mysterion. Guess what English word we get from that Greek word? The mystery. So that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Their heads, so to speak, are on the line, and they don't want to face the fate that these Babylonian advisors are definitely going to face unless Daniel intervenes. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night, and Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And that's the second section of chapter 2. And I think it's really important that we note that Daniel's response after God has heard his prayer and the prayer of his three friends is to say thank you. God blesses us all the time. He hears and answers our prayers. Are we truly grateful? And does our gratitude spill over into immediate thanksgiving? Well, it does so in the case of Daniel. The next section is as follows, beginning in verse 17. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we ask of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. So the mystery has been revealed. Daniel knows the king's dream, and he also knows what that dream meant. And this knowledge was given to him in a vision of the night. We might even say, I suspect, if we were putting this story into our own words, that night he had a dream in which God revealed to him the king's dream and its meaning, because it's one of the most meaningful dreams that any man has ever had. And so he pours out his heart. Blessed be the name of God forever and ever. The name represents the authority, the power, the very essence of the Creator, in whom resides wisdom and might. One of the really interesting things that you can do if you're interested is to compare and contrast the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob with all of the other gods, lower G, gods, that the pagan world worshipped. Isaiah does this in, I think, really dramatic fashion when he says to Israel, you go out and chop down a tree, and you use a third of it to warm your bodies. You build a fire, and you sit or stand around it. You use a third to bake your bread, and you use a third to carve your idol and fall down and worship it. Now just think for a moment how silly and illogical that is. It is the same tree. And then he goes on to point out, after you've made your idol, it doesn't matter if it's wood or stone or precious metal, it can't speak, it can't move, it is powerless, and yet you pray to it. It must be carried from place to place. Does that make sense? And obviously the answer is no, but this was the practice of nearly the entire known world. For all practical purposes, only the children of Abraham were different. He changes times and seasons, removes kings and sets up kings. Paul in Romans chapter 13 made a point of saying that the powers that be are ordained of God. By that he's saying that civil authority is from God himself, that God knew that his creation needed civil authority to govern itself. And this text, and I believe there are others that are similar to it, say that he plays a role in who sits on the throne, who rules the nation. And I mentioned this indirectly in last Sunday's message. This is a reference to the sovereignty of God. The fact that he is the one who truly is in control. And that's the purpose of Daniel. If you want to know, at the very core of the book is the realization that God, not man, is in control. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar will be essentially lowered to an animal existence, the text says, until he comes to the realization that God still rules in the affairs of men. Now, in relationship to his sovereignty, his divine will, I mentioned to you Sunday, I don't know if you caught it or not, that these ideas of divine will or sovereignty can be lumped under one of two headings. There is his permissive will, things that he does not dictate or control or direct, but he allows to happen. And then there is his determinate will. These are the things that God steps in and providentially works to achieve. For instance, God's determinative will was that Abraham be the father of a great nation, but it would take more than 4 centuries, and that nation would develop in a foreign land. Abraham never knew what foreign land God had in mind. But when you read the story of Joseph, you see the providence of God at work, his determinate will exercised to bring about the desired end. And in nearly every way, God worked his will in a non-miraculous fashion. The only miracles that occur in relationship to Joseph and Egypt and Israel finally coming from Canaan into Egypt, where they become this great nation and fulfill the promise that God made to Abraham, the only instance of the miraculous relates, ironically, I think, given our study tonight, to Joseph's ability to interpret dreams. So, God has a permissive will. He has a determinate will. He is sovereign. And this is what Daniel acknowledges. You're the one that gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. In essence, we are what we are because of you. You turn your life over to God, God will use it. You turn away from God, and you face the consequences of that rejection. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It turned their hearts and souls over to God. It's apparent in chapter 1. It's apparent again in chapter 2 and their response here in this setting. He reveals deep and hidden things. There is much in this world that we do not understand. There is nothing that God does not understand. It is a mistake, in my judgment, to try to understand that which God has not revealed. It is in Deuteronomy 29:29 that we encounter this statement. The secret things belong unto the Lord. There are things that we are never going to know this side of eternity. Some of them are matters that, frankly, don't matter. What was Paul's thorn in the flesh? We don't know. We don't need to know. And it does no good to debate about the right answer. Who wrote the letter to the Hebrews? We don't know. We can surmise. I think there is some reason to suggest that perhaps it was Paul, but I can't tell you that with certainty. I don't need to know. But when it comes to who Jesus was, that's a matter that we can be dogmatic about. And the inspiration of the Bible and the existence of God and the sanctity of life and the basis for morality, those things God has revealed. The wise, all-knowing, all-powerful God. And to make the king's matter known for him is not hard at all. In fact, as Daniel interprets the dream, once he's shared it with the king, he will outline the history of that region of the world for several hundred years down the road. What will the stock market do next week? What will be the high temperature next week, and on which day will it fall? And how many days will have rain? I'm talking about next week. What will be the cost of gas next week? It'll be up. I don't know how much. I'm pretty confident it's not coming down, but I don't have a clue how much. You see, there is so little we know about the future. There is nothing about the future that God chooses to know that he doesn't know. Even when Jesus was in the flesh on this earth, there were some things that he did not know. One in particular comes to mind, the time of his second coming. He said, not even the angels in heaven know that. That's knowledge reserved exclusively to the Father. I submit to you now at the right hand of God, he would know the calendar, God's plan. But during his earthly ministry, he acknowledged that he did not know, and no one else knew except God. But the things we need to know, God makes it possible for us to know. And that's what Daniel is saying as he gives thanks to God. Therefore, the text continues, verse 24. Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to the king, or to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation. that's where we're going to finish tonight. Arioch again is the chief executioner. Daniel approaches him and says, "Take me to the king. Let me do what the king has requested. Spare the lives of these Babylonian advisors, and in turn, his life and that of his friends will be spared as well."